we should get started. So apologies everyone for the sound quality apparently of my voice and my speaker. Welcome to the SaferSpaces webinar on crime stats and the implications for safety in South Africa. Today we're going to be discussing the nature and dynamics of violent crime and implication for prevention of violent crime in South Africa. We have two speakers, Dr. Guy Lamb, who is the Director of the Safety and Violence Initiative at University of Cape Town, and he's also at the Department of Political Studies at Stellenbosch University. We also have Lizette Lancaster, who is with the Institute for Security Studies with the Crimehub. So without further ado, should we get into sort of, I think Guy, you're going first because I see your presentation is up. So without further ado, let me hand over to you.
Thanks so much, Lauren. It's a great honor and pleasure to be here. The past few webinars I've been facilitating and sharing, so I can take a break from that. So you're going to hear from me. So yes, I based at the Department of Political Science at Stellenbosch University, but also been running the Safety and Violence Initiative at UCT for a number of years. So what I'm going to do today, and so it's had a conversation with Lizette a number of days ago just around how we're going to tackle this. So we're both going to look at recent crime stats, recent crime trends, but we're going to look at different aspects of it. So what I want to do is really to try and make sense of the most recent violent crime data, particularly looking at murder, but also make reference to other categories of violent crime. So what I'm going to be specifically trying to unpack and not go into detail too much around the figures, is around to look at the trends in terms of the most recent quarterly crime data that was released last week, and to compare that to the previous 2 quarters. So really looking at the 2020 crime data as has been released by the Minister of Police and the South African Police Services, and to try and give you my take on why we've seen differences in the crime data over the past 9 months. So let me open it up. So just to start off with really just looking back and looking at what has the trend been like in South Africa over the past 10 years or so. So I've just pulled 5 categories here just to show you the trend. As you can see, murder, attempted murder, carjacking, robbery at residential premises, and robbery at non-residential premises. All in the upward trajectory. So from 2010, 2011 onwards, up until the most recent annual crime stats that came out September, October last year. So it gives you an idea of trend. So all those categories of crime have gone up. So these are reported crime incidences, not rates. The South African Police Services typically over the years hasn't produced rates per 100,000. But if we were to show rates per 100,000 for those crime categories, they would also be in an upward trajectory. So what I want to do now is really just look at and discuss the 3 quarterly crime data series that we've received from the South African Police Services, which is really refreshing because up until recently, we didn't get quarterly crime stats. We only got annual crime stats. And at that point, the data was, more than a year old. With the quarterly crime stats, we can actually see, things happening in shorter spaces of time. And I think 2020 for all of us has been a really interesting year, a very difficult year, but it's also been very interesting from a criminal offending point of view, from a reported crime point of view. So with the crime data, also what happened is that the new quarter corresponded when hard lockdown started. So the quarter from the 1st of April to the 30th of June 2020 corresponded with a lot with the hard lockdown period, which was mainly April and May, but obviously there were some restrictions in June as well. And then we went into lesser restrictions between July and September, and then there were even further lifting of the restrictions, the lockdown restrictions in the October to December period. So if one was ready to sort of define or label these particular periods, the green April to June could be hard lockdown, the orange could be sort of a sort of lockdown medium, and the red could be a lockdown light. And what we've seen that's quite interesting, if we look at crime data for 2020 and then compare it to the same period in 2019, there's some very interesting differences that emerge. So this is data that's pulled right out of the SAPS's crime data. So for example, in April to June 2020, if you compare it to the same period a year earlier in 2019, there were some dramatic changes within reported crime. So you had in pretty much all categories of violent crime, dramatic reductions in reported crime. So murder, close to 36%, sexual offences close to 40%. You've got more than 40% in terms of assault with to inflict grievous bodily harm. So that's the hard lockdown period. Then you get to lesser lockdown period, lockdown medium, and you can see also, if you compare July to September of 2020 to the previous year, you can also see in a number of categories and most categories of crime that the reported crime is far less. There's significant percentages. Some have gone up, for example, attempted murder, but generally there is, still lower than the previous year. And then we get to October 2020. And with the exception of a couple of categories, is actually we're seeing increases, which is quite substantial, because there were still lockdown regulations in place, not as severe as the previous periods, but we're seeing significant increases. So obviously the concern here is murder at 6.6% in terms of the increase in incidences, but also attempted murder at close to 9%. So I'm going to try and kind of unpack this a little bit more and then get into some explanations. So just giving you an idea of numbers here over the 3 quarters of 2020 that we have certainly from April. And just as by way of explanation for those who are unfamiliar with police statistics take their reporting year from the 1st of April up until the 31st of March in the next year. So that's why the first quarter starts in April. And if you kind of just look at the number of incidences that are happening for these different categories of crime, and I'm not going to go through them, you can see if you were to compare the April to June period with the October to December period, that there's significant increases in crime for pretty much all of the categories there. And I'll sort of try and unpack that a bit more in the sort of an explanation going forward. So really, it's like, what can explain these kind of variations? So it's a bit of a busy slide, and what the diagram I put up is something I constructed for the South African Cities Network for the Urban Safety Reference Group a number of years ago, which really sort of takes classic criminological theory into account. And it says, well, how and why does violent interpersonal crime happens? You need to have a victim, you have to have a perpetrator, they have to kind of the violent crime occurs in a specific physical space. Of course, cybercrime is something different. There usually is, it often occurs in a space where there's an absence of a sort of a guardian or a police. It often takes place if they're crime facilitators. So, for example, if an offender has a gun, or if there has been, consumption of large quantities of alcohol, and that alcohol can, kind of facilitates arguments between perpetrator and victim or between individuals, and that can then lead to violence. So, of course, there are other things here, talking about intimate handlers around often potential perpetrators of crime. If there is someone who can exert some sort of influence over these people, then what can happen is that they might not commit the crime necessarily. So that's the kind of thinking, quite robust criminological theory. So we can apply that to looking at these 3 quarters of crime stats. So during the sort of hard lockdown period, we had, as we all know, quite severe restrictions on the movement of people. So we weren't supposed to leave our homes unless we needed to go to the shops, or we needed medical attention, or unless we had a permit, but very few people had permits. We also had this increased police visibility. So a lot of police on the streets to enforce the lockdown regulations, and combining the enforcement of lockdown regulations with crime combating operations. We saw the military being deployed. So a lot of security force members that were visible and in places where compliance was not so good. Often these places where compliance was not so good often corresponded to high crime areas. And also a key issue was severe restriction of access to alcohol. You couldn't buy it, it was banned. If you had it, of course, you could consume it. But other indications is potentially there was some, suggestions there'd been gang truces in place and announcements of gang truces. And, a lot of the crime, particularly in the Western Cape and the city of Cape Town, is driven by inter-gang conflict or conflict between gangsters. But there also was possibly even reductions in the reporting of crime. So individuals may have been victims of crime but didn't report it to the police because they couldn't get to police stations, or felt there was no need to do it, or the police were reluctant in certain places to record that crime. So these are all certain possibilities. Then we hit the period of June to September, the sort of medium lockdown period. We still have some restrictions in terms of population movement. There is access to alcohol, but it's still restricted and controlled. You can't get it when you want it. there is police visibility, but a lot less. So, the police aren't having to enforce the sort of stay-at-home rule. But we are seeing an uptick in gang violence. Not at the levels that we've seen previously, but certainly we're seeing reports of gang violence. Then we get to the sort of lockdown light, where the restrictions, are still in place, but they're fairly minimal. Minimal restrictions around alcohol. Police visibility also reduced compared to the hard lockdown period. And then we sort of see quite, numerous incidences of gang violence, so the sense of around the gang wars that had been prevalent in sort of the 2019 period, certainly reigniting and becoming a lot clearer. And then just a sort of a sense of looking forward, what are we likely to see, certainly for the quarter from the 1st of January up until the end of March 2021? And if we kind of look at this particular model and look at the trends from what's happened in 2020, is we're likely to see an increase in crime because, we're likely to, I must say, we may not see an increase in crime. There needs to be a correction there because of the alcohol ban, certainly during January. Also, the less severe movement of people and gang conflicts. So sorry, I will make the adjustment on the slide if anyone wants it, but it's likely probably to see a decrease. But it's unclear because it's really only alcohol that is the key thing that's been changed here. Obviously, there were curfews in place, but it will be really interesting to see the next quarter on crime and what impact alcohol, the reduction of access to alcohol had, because of the other factors that influence crime offending weren't necessarily there. Then I just want to kind of go into a further sort of analysis of the most recent period, so the period from October to December, and really kind of drill down a little bit into try and understand why we've seen these increases in violent crime. So an important thing always about violent crime within South Africa is not evenly distributed across the country. It is concentrated in a number of areas. So there are about 1,100 police areas or police precincts in South Africa. And certainly for more than 20 years and even before that, violent crime tended to be highly concentrated in about 200 of those areas. Murder tends to be even less, around 100. And what we know from the recent crime data is that 25% of murders happen in only 13 precincts. And even in some of those 13 precincts, they're quite low. There's some that are up there that you have more than 300 murders per year happening. So we really, if we want to get a grip and a better understanding of changes and variations in violent crime, we really need to go and look at these high crime areas and understand the dynamics there. So what I did, and I wrote an opinion piece for News 24. It came out, I think, earlier this week. Unfortunately, it's behind a paywall. But I was interested to see the increase in murders compared to the period of what happened in 2020 compared to the same period in 2019. So we had, if you were to look at the numbers, so there was about 389 kind of excess murders or more murders in 2020 in October to December compared to 2019. So the interesting thing was to look, where did these excess murders happen? And if you look at it, there were about 50% of them took place in only 8 policing precincts, which of course is very revealing. And if you kind of look at these 8, many of them are in the Western Cape. So you've got Kraaifontein, Harare, Manenberg, Plessis Lyre in KwaZulu-Natal, Lenasia in Gauteng, Samora Machel in the Western Cape, Dutwa within the Eastern Cape, and Mufuleni in the Western Cape. So big concentration in the Western Cape. And as traditionally we've seen the number of Western Cape policing precincts having the highest violent crime rates within South Africa. So this is my final slide, is really just to kind of, from quite a superficial way, just look at and explore what's been going on in these places. So this is based on some publications, but largely on media reports and on police reports, and to try and see, is there anything specific going on in these places that can explain such increases in the murder incidences over the most recent quarter. So if we look at Kraaifontein, and Kraaifontein is a concern because the number of murders sort of increased dramatically over the third quarter of 2020 compared to last year, but certainly have been the epicenters of a resurgent gang war in Cape Town. I mean, the gang war has been going on for 10 years, but it's ebbed and flowed, but seen a number of assassinations in late 2020 happening there, and also numerous gang-related shootings. So people, residents who have nothing to do with gang conflicts getting caught in the crossfire, or revenge killings happening as a result of an assassination. Then in Lenasia, it's been an ongoing crime challenge within Lenasia, breakdown in relationship between the police and the community. I've seen in previous years where the tactical response team were even sent in to try and stabilize the situation within Lenasia. So it remains an unstable place from a criminal offending point of view. So there is gang violence going on. There have been cases of vigilantism happening within Lenasia, so that can potentially explain increases in Lenasia. Then Harare and Mufuleni, we've seen issues around local level or city level organized crime, particularly around extortion from informal businesses, particularly from shebeens and other businesses, where you've got organized criminal groups who are competing with each other and using violence as a way to try and eliminate competition or to get compliance out of business owners. Then, particularly in Harare, and for those familiar with Cape Town, the Harare Policing Precinct kind of borders on nature reserve area, dune reserves along the coast off Baden-Powell Drive, and there isn't any developments there, and there's it's very easy to go and dump and hide a body there. So a number of bodies certainly were found for murder victims in the latter part of 2020. And then Samora Machel, which it's a newish policing station. It's born out of, used to be part of Philippi East, which is renowned for very high criminal offending, and there have been problems of ongoing lawlessness. The anti-gang unit has had challenges within Samora Machel. It's a particularly dangerous place, and even under lockdown, the hard lockdown period, when pretty much every station across the country, with some exceptions, and Samora Machel was one of them, had an increase in murder, and Samora Machel had an increase in murder quite significantly during hard lockdown. And then Plessis Laya in KZN also has a sort of long history of violence, ongoing political assassinations that happen, taxi violence, and also murders linked to robberies. And then just a final aspect of this, in all these areas, there is this constant issue of access to alcohol abuse, and alcohol abuse fueling violence. And we know from the data and the analysis that SAPs present every year, and even they started to do it in their quarterly presentations when they look at what are the circumstances around murders based on quite a big docket analysis. They point to arguments and disagreements and misunderstandings as the key driver of many murders. And of course, alcohol underlies a lot of that. Of course, then these areas are affected by availability of guns or firearms, and also varying degrees of police visibility and trust in the police. So really, as something to conclude with, it's when we trying to understand these crime trends within high crime areas, there are multiple factors at play here. And sort of, I think the real point to emphasize here is that discourse often in more recent times has really just become about alcohol. And of course, alcohol is a key driver, as I've indicated, of violent crime, but it's not the only driver. And so therefore, we do need to be looking at other factors. So let me end there. Thank you so much, Lauren. And welcome any questions or comments, or people are welcome to disagree with me, challenge me. I'm happy to engage with you afterwards. So let me stop there and back to you, Lauren.
Okay, great. Thank you, guys. It was very interesting. Shall I hand over to Lizette then, if you can continue with your presentation?
Thank you, Lauren. Thank you, Guy. That was always interesting. No matter how many years I work with crime stats, it always remains a fascinating topic, probably because we know so little, especially at local levels. So my name is Lizette Lancaster. Good afternoon, everybody. I am the manager of the Crime and Justice Information Hub at the Institute for Security Studies. And I look mostly at different crime statistics and different open source data relating to the criminal justice system and try and make sense of it all. So that is, in short, part of my job. Of course, it's never that simple. So I'm just going to share my presentation with you. Just want to see which one is presenting. Can you see it?
Yes. You can see it.
Now I'm just trying to move the little seminar thingy. Okay, so I'm just going to touch on some of the stuff that Guy has been saying. I think it is absolutely important to take note of these aspects that he mentioned. And I think the first thing we need to always understand is that crime statistics is only a measure of reported and recorded crime by the police. And reporting is heavily influenced by a range of factors, such as the belief that a crime is serious enough to report, that people believe that their goods will be recovered, that stolen property is insured and maybe we need a case number, or that, you know, it is worth their while to report. Often people feel that the stigma of reporting or the further trauma caused by reporting it makes it not worth reporting. So now I must just find a way to scroll down. Okay, so when we get to the crime statistics, I think it's also important to understand what the police provide to us. They provide what they call 17 community reported serious crimes. These are broken up in the contact crime categories, the violent crime categories that Guy showed us. That makes up about 38% of all crime. That is recorded and reported. And then you have others, such as contact-related crimes. That's the arsons and the malicious damage to property. The other serious crime is about 26%. That's theft. Other, it is this huge catch-all category. And then there's also one called commercial crime that is also a catch-all category for anything to do with fraud, theft in a type of business environment. And shoplifting. Then there's the second largest category that is called property-related crimes. These are the theft of motor vehicles, burglaries, and such. Now, for numerous years since democracy, we've seen these decreases in most property-related crimes. That has followed international trends. And we saw it again during the quarterly crime statistics. In the last quarter, the only one of these crime statistics that actually showed quite a significant increase was commercial crime. That's probably relating to cybercrime, online fraud, and such that was reported to the police. But I'm also going to just focus on most of the violent crime and what that means to us going forward. The other crime category that I must make mention of is the crimes dependent on police action. Now, these are the roadblocks and the stop and searches and the raids that the police do. That's almost 300,000 a year. And we've seen some significant decreases in these type of crimes for most part because of the Constitutional Court ruling on marijuana. And so we would have seen some decreases again, but of course we also saw that the police really went for roadblocks during the lockdown period. So, and that is quite an important factor, because if the police are busy elsewhere, sometimes it's very difficult to stop crime happening from where they happen in houses, streets and such, because the police are busy somewhere else. Okay, but we will hopefully get back to that. So just to look at our murder for 2019-2020, the last time we had a full year, we've seen that about, and I know it's a seriously crude indicator, but we look at about 59 murders per day on average. If we have to crudely put this into gender or a sex category, we'll see 48 men, 7 women, and 3 children on average a day. Of course, there's a very strong temporal aspect to murder. And as Guy pointed out, 50% of murders happen in only about 12% of police stations. And most murders actually or half of murders take place over weekends, indicating its social fabric or social interpersonal fabric. From previous docket analysis by the police, we saw again that arguments and misunderstandings make up the largest proportion, followed by domestic violence and things such as mob justice or vigilantism, and followed by armed robberies or robberies in general. An equal amount to or number to gang-related crime. So this is really important because it shows that different causes also need different interventions, and we'll get back to that. Now, before lockdown, these were the crime statistics. Up till end of March last year, we saw over an 8-year period a 71% increase in carjacking, 11% in residential robberies. Non-residential robberies, we saw a 15% increase, which gave us an overall aggravated robbery increase of 26%. But this doesn't tell us the whole picture, because there's one category that is missing, and that's called street robberies. Oops, sorry. So when we start comparing the different quarters to the last full, so this is a very busy slide and I apologize profusely for it. What it does is, let me just open it again and try and get this thing down or away or something, which doesn't want to work right now. We saw that in Q1 so let me just explain. So here are some of the violent crime categories. This is Q1, Q2 numbers, Q3 numbers, and then what I did was, again, a terribly crude percent or calculation called daily rate. So for Q1, 2, and 3 in these columns, this is the total for all 3 columns, and I compare it. This is the previous year, and I look at what proportion it made up when we compare to the previous year. So look, it's very crude, but it just tries to give us a comparison of what we're dealing with. So again, looking at murder, we saw that there were still, during hard lockdown, 38 murders per 100,000 population on average. Q2, it increased to 56, and Q3, it actually went above our average, which it normally does, because December is always a very volatile and violent time in our history, or in the crimes, for the crime stats. So we saw 68 murders per 100,000. So this is quite concerning. And for this year already, we had around 70% of what it would normally have been in a year. But the one thing that these statistics released by the police do not tell us is what makes up this aggravated robbery figure, this huge figure that drive a lot of the violent crime together with what we see assault and common assault doing. And that is the aggravated robberies. When we start unpacking it, we see that it is often driven by what they call the trio crimes, the carjacking, the robbery residential, the robbery non-residential, the business robberies. So these are high. They still have, they varied from about 29 hijackings a day on average to 52 by Q2 and 3. So we didn't see these huge drops, even in hard lockdown, which I think is quite scary. I mean, these didn't even halve during hard lockdown. But even more worrying is the one that is never shown up. We just call it street robbery, but it's the aggravated robbery other. And we know that most of them happen on the street. So we try and calculate these. So still, even under hard lockdown, we had 125 street robberies reported to the police on average a day. By Q3, it's gone up to 201. And I wish I could get rid of my little webinar thing. But let me just try and move this a bit so that you can see. Oh, there we go. So what it does show, though, compared to the previous year, where we had 82, almost 83,000 street robberies reported to the police for the full year, or 57% of all aggravated robberies, we have seen quite a drop in the number because it is not even close to where we used to see the numbers. These 3 quarters only made up about 56% of the previous year's reported numbers. So that's quite interesting. So, but before we analyze why that happens, let's just look at street robbery and the facts around it. Oops, sorry, guys. There we go. So this was done a couple of years ago, and we saw these dramatic increases in the previous years. By 2018-19, we saw a 39% increase on average in South Africa, but it varied amongst the different provinces. What was particularly shocking is when you look at the Western Cape, you saw almost a 68% increase in our street robberies reported to the police, 55% in Gauteng. And of course, as I pointed out in the previous, in 2019, 2020, we saw it still increasing to about 82, almost 83,000. We also know that robberies, and particularly something like street robberies, are particularly are influenced by effective policing, because it is what some have termed policeable type of crimes. It is where the police can make a difference. And why street robberies should be a priority and why it's so important is because this is where career robbers hone in on their skills. You know, it starts off as small gangs that form. And we also know that if you reduce street robberies, you will start reducing other forms of violence, such as murder. Because when you look at that original motives, you see these armed robbery sections. Well, if you actually hone in on certain hotspots, you will see that very often murder is driven by, oh, now I've gone the wrong way, by those very same type of crimes. What is more shocking is despite the 83,000 street robberies reported to the police, more than 65%, it's now with the latest victims of crime survey around 60%, of street robberies are never reported to the police. So the number is more than double that. We're looking more at probably around 200,000 a year. And there might even be more than that. And we also see that traditionally they sort of peak in November, December. So the problem, though, is that the criminal justice system is not dealing with these type of robberies. They actually, very few of them get solved. Very few of the cases go to court. Very few get prosecuted, and even fewer lead to prosecutions. When we look at armed robbery in general, and we look at the arrest rates or the number of arrests through the years, we see that there was this dip in 2011, 2012. And it's just, we see this huge number of arrests, but yet they don't necessarily translate into detection or conviction. When we look at detection, we see that there was this inverse relationship where, although there were fewer cases that were, or arrests made during 2012, for instance, we saw that the detection rate was far higher, probably because there was a more focused attention on the correct arrests and the correct investigation of cases. We now see that that has dropped to about 17 detected cases, 17%. So that is quite concerning. Now, what do we know about aggravated robberies or street robberies in particular? Now, an amazing study that was done by colleagues of mine Ian Edelstein, Robert Arnault, and Dr. Andrew Fall, was that when you start looking at hotspot analysis, this was for Nyanga, I think, you see that point data provided by the police have clustering effects. There are hotspots that can be identified. And it is then very important that we focus on these hotspots because they can tell us when, where, and how crimes happen. If you want to download this paper, it is on the Crimehub. There is the link. Now, what do we know? We know that internationally, responding to crime hotspots work, but you need to have particular types, or you have to identify what the problem is, such as gangsterism, street robbery, and get the evidence to show that you can get from the police, or you can do your own evaluations, victim surveys, safety audits, and such. And there's international evidence that show that focusing police resources in such areas or hotspots reduce crime without significantly displacing this crime. So regularly visiting hotspots actually does work. And this type of analysis and this type of solutions come from our evidence-based policing guide that was released yesterday. It's also on the Crimehub. And I think it can be very useful. But I also want to stop there simply because I think I've touched on a lot of points throughout my presentation, and you might want to engage in the Q&A instead of me just talking through some of these issues. But just the last point I want to highlight, when we look at even the Q1 type of statistics, yes, those reductions should be celebrated. But these are still alarmingly high numbers. Even an alcohol ban could not, and curfews could not reduce our violence levels significantly. Yes, in some cases it nearly halved, but not everywhere. And clearly it is not just those things that we need. We need the multi-sectoral approach that everybody's always talking about. But this is, if there's anything that we need to take away from this past year, is that even if you do these hard policings, hard lockdown, restrict liquor, it's not going to solve our violence problem. Food insecurity is linked to interpersonal violence. So too is collective trauma and how we deal with conflict and stress, how we deal with our children and impacts on how they act in the long term and their risky behavior potentially. So there's a lot we still need to learn, and I hope that this at least provides some basis for that type of discussion. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Lizette. I think that was very interesting, and some of the results were a bit contrary to what I was expecting, so it's really insightful to check that out. I'm now going to open up for comments and questions. We have about 37 minutes for that, so it's a nice and long time for discussion. We're going to be using the raise the hand function. If everybody knows where it is, it's the smiley face up at the top with the hand. So I'm going to give you a couple of minutes to raise your hands, and we can check what how many people have questions, and then give that to the speakers. Okay, so while I'm waiting for people to raise hands, let me also just inform you, for those of you who don't know, that SaferSpaces is a web platform. It's a knowledge hub and a resource directory that was made from the partnership between GIZ, the Civilian Secretariat for Police, and the Safety and Violence Initiative. So this webinar is the 5th in a series of webinars which we are holding to discuss key elements of the white paper on safety and security. So after this webinar, please do come to the other webinars, which will be, we're having them from January to April, every Friday between 12:45 to 2 p.m. Is there anyone that has any comments and questions? Please raise your hands.
Lauren, I see there are a couple of questions in the chat.
Yes.
I will take those questions. I will respond to those questions. So just for the other participants, just have a look at the chat to see what the questions are. There's also a question for Lizette in that chat as well. So just to let Ludwig know that we are aware of them. So thank you.
Great. Yes, I see 2 questions in the chat. If you're having any trouble raising your hands, please do also just feel free to unmute yourselves and ask questions.
Lauren, I'm happy to jump in terms of responding to the questions in the chat so far, and I think Lizette also has a question there, so maybe we'll start with that, and then people can put up their hands when they kind of as questions become, kind of come to mind. So Ludwig, I think that's a really interesting question around sort of firearms. So particularly in relation to murder, we've seen. Let me put on just 1 second. Just want to put on my camera so you can see me. Yeah, so Ludwig, a very good question about firearms in high crime areas. I mean, I've done a number of studies around this. The police indicate every year, particularly around murder and to a certain degree attempted murder and some other categories of violent crime where firearms are the leading weapon used in these types of crime. Obviously, in high crime areas, we don't have data around whether these firearms are legal or illegal, but they're most likely most of them are illegal. They don't say owned, possessed by people who don't have firearm licenses. And so the issue is, I mean, if we look back, the police were quite effective in having focused high density operations in high crime areas where they had a key priority was seizing of firearms. And you had in 2000 Operation Crackdown, which was quite effective. And then you had in 2003, 2004 around there was Operation Satunya. And Satunya was specifically looking at firearms, going in and really trying to seize and collect and confiscate as many firearms as possible. And you can actually see the consequences of those operations that brought down the murder rate quite considerably as a result of taking those firearms out. The police have been focusing on firearms, and you can see the cases if you look at the incidences relating to illegal possession of firearms and ammunition, that those cases have remained relatively constant. They're fairly high. I think the challenge has been, particularly in areas where there are gang conflicts, is that the gangs have become a lot more adept at hiding those weapons. But also the police haven't had the focused operations that they previously did, because they now just do what they're calling Operation Feeler 2, which is more just high density operations, and they will look to collect weapons where they can, where they don't have a dedicated focused type of operation. And the anti-gang unit does, I think, look at these things, but I think it's the argument I've been making for a number of years is to say we need to kind of go back to have a dedicated firearm strategy that has what Lizette has been talking about, a hotspot analysis. You go to the area where crime is the highest. So I won't go into much more detail around that. I think there was a question about SADF. Sorry, let me just have a look at the good question there. Was the presence of SAA linked to periods to see if they had any impacts on crime stats? It was what happened there, and I think there was a lot of emphasis in the media and in the public discourse about sending in the military because it had been highly politicized, but the military have actually been sent in with the police for a number of years in these joint operations, and these joint operations where they've had a lot more manpower than they've typically had, and the military providing, cordon protection and additional security in these kind of high crime area operations can be quite effective. The Operation Lockdown, which is the most recent one, it's unclear if we can't make clear, correlations between that and, and kind of crime rates, because we would have to look at the deployment patterns. And the problem is that they were moving around all the time. It wasn't like going into one particular area and spending a lot of time there and dealing with the particular issues there. So it's unclear if it was effective or not. So I unfortunately can't answer that question, but doesn't seem to have made a major dent in certainly criminal offending in the Western Cape or in the city of Cape Town. Maybe Lizette, if you want to comment on some of those questions as well, or your own question.
Thank you, Guy, and thank you, Ludwig. Yes, I'm so glad you're asking these questions, Ludwig, because I don't think I was rushing so much. I was trying to say so much that I probably didn't say it as clearly as I should have. And that is that we saw, I'm going to start with my question and then move also to the patrol's question, sort of add on to what Guy has said, is we saw the significant reduction in street robberies, which led in these 3 quarters, which drove the reduction in aggravated robberies. And so there was this reduction. It is very plausible that street robberies reduced simply because of curfews, because of less people moving around, and the same with some of the armed robberies. So the opportunities were potentially, in terms of routine activity theory and stuff, there were less targets and such. However, we also saw that for some cases there might have been more increase in burglaries, like business burglaries. So it could have been a displacement as well. But the point I'm trying to make is that there's always a danger going forward, and we've seen it with Crackdown, where when resources are concentrated, policing resources in certain areas, people know that there are roadblocks, there are operations going on, people move to other areas, and it's not so much the case with street robberies because they are very localized. They are often by gangs from the area and such. But one must be just very cautious when we interpret all these statistics. I was trying to give us almost like a speed date of factors. And it is, one must be very cautious that there are other crimes that could have been committed because the police resources weren't being utilized the way they normally are. To reduce those crimes. If you go after liquor and you go after that type of thing, other crimes can be committed that the police don't necessarily detect. We have seen during these quarters a reduction in the number of firearms that were confiscated, for example. Why that is, I don't know, but that is one of the things we might want to unpack going forward. So that, I hope, answers some of the question around also the patrolling, say, of beaches and how it impacts on crime committed somewhere else. I think what we did see is potentially crime becoming more localized, people not because movement is restricted. So where armed robbers would have moved into, say, a CBD to go and commit crime, they might have done it closer to home. We also, of course, saw a lot of organized crime networks forming because of illegal cigarettes and alcohol taking shape. And those networks also expanded into areas that traditionally weren't serviced by those organized crime syndicates. So it's a very interesting mixture of things, and it's going to take us years to unpack. And it is, in the words of, what is the father of routine activity guy, Felsen and such, they've been writing quite a bit about what COVID means for analysis. And the one thing they are urging is that academics start looking at different crime types and then try and unpack where, how, why it happens, because then only will we be able to understand what the influences, what the drivers were. And I think, to me, that is what we're taking away from these quarterly crime stats to some extent.
Okay, thanks to our speakers. I see we have 2 hands up, so I'm going to take both questions, and then if there's another one, I'll take that one. But let's hand over Terence. I see your hand is up, or if you want to ask a question.
Thanks, Lauren, and thanks, Guy and Lizette, for very, very interesting presentations. I have 3 quick questions. The one is around the concentration of crime in hotspots. I mean, this is something we've known for years, and the data is very clear. What do you think is stopping at least from a policing point of view, policing being, resources being more directed into these hotspots? Is it happening? It's not something I know so much about, but is it happening, or to the extent that it needs to, or what is stopping that kind of very evidence-based approach to policing? The second is to both of you, but Guy, you talked about it specifically, the relationship between alcohol and crime. And as you said, it's a very, or violent crime. As you said, it's a very complex issue, interrelated with a whole range of other factors. But at least from a media point of view, the relationship is portrayed in a very simplistic way, that trauma cases at hospitals went down dramatically. Therefore, most of those were either car accidents or violent crime. But I'd love if you could just elaborate a little bit more on how you see the relationship as it plays out in the data. And then thirdly, something you didn't mention, which I found interesting, is gender-based violence. Obviously, this has been the theme around lockdown related to crime and violence. And we know most of or a large proportion of intimate partner violence happens in a domestic space, may not be reported, etc. But it would be interesting just to get your take on what the numbers say. Thanks.
Thanks, Terence. Let me take Mike's question first before I hand over back to the speakers. Mike, go ahead.
Thanks very much, Lauren. Thanks to Guy and to Lizette for great overview there. I'm fascinated by the perspective about interpersonal violence. Lizette, I think you had a slide there that showed it was 38% of all crime, which is really high. And I think that's not new. I've got some slides from ISS over a number of years that show it goes up and down, but it's usually typically in the 30%. So I think my question is, well, obviously we know that context plays a big role. So things like poverty, poor conditions would obviously feed into tension that would come out in things like interpersonal violence. But it strikes me that we do know quite a bit about this, and it is the kind of thing that one could get a practical, tangible handle on at both a macro level and a more micro level in terms of teaching those skills. So in the heat of the moment, probably it's not going to be a huge benefit, or it would have limited benefit. But over time, if that was something we were concentrating on, at a school level, at a community level, encouraging the deployment of people who can assist informally as mediators to what's the word I'm looking for, to diffuse conflicts. Surely that would make a significant difference to this category of crime. So my question is that happening at all, to your knowledge, in any sort of organized, systematic way, from any point in the justice sector? Thanks.
Thanks, Mike. I'm going to hand it back to Guy and Lizette now to deal with those two comments and then open up for another round. So Guy and Lizette.
Sure. Happy to jump in. Maybe just start off with a couple of thoughts that I'd had just listening to what Lizette and what Lizette had said around street robberies, and what a couple of comments and questions, and then I'll get to the specific questions. So Lizette, your comment about street robbery is really interesting, because also the consequence of that is the link to vigilantism, and what certainly the Khayelitsha Commission of Inquiry report into the breakdown and the relationship between the Khayelitsha residents and the police pointed to the fact that most residents in an area like Khayelitsha don't report street robbery because they're not going to get any results. Maybe the satisfaction of someone listening to you, but the police weren't listening to them. So you use other groups to go and get your stuff back for you, and you pay them to do that because you're not insured, so you do that. So it's that kind of link as well, and Ron, so it's really supporting your view about why we need to focus on street robbery and how it is one of those kind of interventions that can actually have very positive knock-on effects. And then it was your comments about the kind of how COVID has affected different categories of crime. And the one thing that is just anecdotally keeping an eye on, and you see odd reports about it, and it's particularly been a focus within Cape Town, maybe a bit in Johannesburg, but the sense of around where the street robbers and the gangs have adopted or changed their modus operandi. So typically they would hit, gangs, the higher up gangs would hit the nightclubs in terms of to fleece them for money and protection rackets and those kind of things. But of course, with the nightclubs and bars being closed, it seems as though a number of those gangs then moved to the coffee bars and the restaurants, and certainly within Khayelitsha and Gugulethu and Fulani and other places, you've seen these different groups. I think it's like Boko Haram is the name of one gang that is calling himself, but I mean, using quite extensive violence to extort money out of different businesses, and they may have been doing different forms of crime, and how COVID's changed that. So it's really to support your point you've made there. Then it was the kind of question about, I think, Terence, your question about, crime hotspots, and we know a lot about it, and what are the police doing and not doing. I mean, the point here is that SAPs collect, they have real-time data on these things. They map the data. They know where the criminal offending's happening. We know, unfortunately, crime intelligence is in a crisis. That's on national media all the time. Stories still on Daily Maverick today about it. But certainly in terms of from a police station point of view, they can see on a real-time basis or on a daily basis where crime is heated or not heated. And it's more, I think, of the sense of the kind of institutional response to this and having this kind of coordinated and focused response. And that is why sort of you kind of quite reactive. And I think they've been quite resistant to changing things. So that's why what the ISS is doing around their kind of evidence-informed policing, evidence-led policing, and forming a partnership with SAPs, I think that can potentially go somewhere, because all the good work around hotspots where you've seen results happen is when the police have worked with researchers and research institutes and universities to say, okay, this is the area we're going to focus in, and having really good data and good analysis to help them do their work. So, for example, in the States, they had some excellent researchers working with them and advising the police around, if you go in at this time, you will have this effect. If you go in that time, if you spend, a certain amount of minutes here. And, that's, I think, what the ISS is offering is something that hopefully the police do take on quite seriously. I know they are they're planning on rolling it out in the Eden district on the Garden route, and then hopefully take it forward from there. Then your questions around gender-based violence, Terence, and maybe just to focus specifically on men's violence against women. And I just had some numbers at the beginning around it, and then the point you made was that the data, unfortunately, isn't reliable because it's reporting issues. So, many victims don't report it because it's for a variety of reasons. It's dangerous. They feel that they'll have secondary victimization. So there's a whole lot of literature around. It's typically not reported. But the interesting thing around the reported crime is that it went up significantly. Sexual violence, rape, sort of sexual crimes and rape went up, significantly over the 3 quarters. And we know from what data was put out from the GBV command center, call center, around the number of calls that were received. And of course, gender-based violence issue here is a question mark around alcohol, because we know alcohol is a major facilitator of men's violence against women in the domestic context within the home. But when you lock down potential perpetrators with potential victims in this very space under a lot of stress, and people are losing jobs, where you could potentially escape those sort of situations, you can't. So I think this also talks to this sort of segueing into this question you raised around alcohol and the way in which it's described, because certainly it really showed in the sort of domestic violence that alcohol is the key, but it's not the only key. There are many other drivers of this kind of violence, from toxic or pro-violence masculinity that's out there. In terms of past trauma, we know from a lot of men who perpetrate violence against women is that they have suffered various traumas throughout their life, particularly in childhood, associated with men who share similar views to them. Then, of course, there's issues around unemployment, but that's not a big determining factor, but it's part of the mix as well. So this kind of issue around alcohol, I think it is an important conversation to have, but we really need to be looking at what specific role it plays in all of this. So I think I've answered most of the questions here. So let me hand over to Lizette, and I can always come back if there's some follow-up questions. muted, Lizette.
Oh, I thought I unmuted myself and then looked down. Thank you for those interesting questions and insights. You know, we can talk about this the whole all day because it's fascinating, and we actually have more questions than answers, I think, at this stage. But let me just start with your question, Terence, about hotspot analysis. So if you, I should actually just post the link in the chat to the document that Ian, Robert and Andrew wrote on the case studies of Nyanga. What is fascinating there is, and they discuss it quite in detail, the process that should happen at a station level. The whole idea that the CIMAC, the crime intelligence and the analysts sit together, they work together, they identify hotspots, they plot these areas, and they then should ideally go to an emerging hotspot, investigate why it's an emerging hotspot, then engage with the patrols to look at this hotspot and to come up with a strategy or a plan. That's what should happen. That is how it was designed to happen, but of course we know it does not necessarily happen like that. And it's not unique to South Africa. Studies overseas have even showed there was a study that showed that often what police think are hotspots, what they think are the problematic streets or the problematic people, are not the problematic places, streets, people. That's why you need evidence. You need over time this data. You need to know where, when, where, how it happens, and then police it on a regular basis. The data show that if you do that, you will actually not displace crime. So it is absolutely important we start looking at this at a station level, especially in these crime hotspot areas. And what might work for one hotspot, apologies, that's hectic Joburg thunder here. What happens in one hotspot is not necessarily what's happening in another, even for something like street robbery. So it's really important that all actors sit with partners, you know, community leaders and business owners and such, and understand that area, that hotspot. It's often as big as 56 square meters. That's what's also in that document. So there's a lot that must be done and that should be done, but is not done. And I think this emphasis is really important. We have discussed this at provincial levels with the police. We have discussed this at a national level with agencies such as the NPA. The problem is that there's this strategy called trio crimes. So people focus on the trio crimes, the house robberies, the business robberies, the carjackings, without really understanding that the feeder for these criminals are the street robberies. And that street robberies affect the poor and the marginalized far more than these other crimes do. And that street robberies are actually almost 60% of all armed robberies and most of common robberies. So there's a lot to be said about street robberies, and it's something we are working on. In terms of alcohol, I think I've sort of said what I did in terms of if we just look purely at the numbers, we cannot, it cannot explain the alarmingly high levels of violence that still remained during lockdown, hard lockdown, where alcohol was banned. It could be that some people had access. We know pineapple prices went up, so many people made their own beer. So it is very difficult to quantify what percentage can be ascribed to violence or to alcohol. But what we do know is that the violence levels, despite all these other factors changing, was still alarmingly high. And then I hope you can still hear me because it's bucketing down. In terms of GBV, just to add to what, Guy was saying, is an interesting factor. And again, there we've got more questions than answers at this stage. But we also know that when it also came to child abuse, to that type of sexual offences against children and minors, that some reductions could be because they were guardians at home, especially during hard lockdown. So guardianship was often increased, which then offsets, of course, some of the fact that people were locked up together, perpetrators and victims. So that's another aspect to look at. But of course, again, we can't quantify. The previous trauma is such an important issue when you look at interpersonal violence. And Mike, this is sort of goes into your questions. If there's one thing we really need to address in this country, it is collective trauma, because it underpins all forms of violence, and I think that is a very interesting aspect for a later webinar as well, where you actually need to speak to psychologists and trauma counsellors and such. I'm not qualified to discuss it all here, but it's definitely something we need to look at. And then from the child gauge and from discussions around that was released last year, it is clear that food insecurity plays an important role. Research has shown that it plays an important role in interpersonal violence. Men are more likely to be abusive if they are hungry. It is the basis of a lot of the research. And of course, not to talk, there's a lot said about children that are hungry. So that needs to be unpacked as well. That's also a really good topic for further research and discussion. So Mike, yes, we need to unpack mediation. We need more mediation. There's been amazing work that has been done. We know that mediation works. The stuff you've been involved in is internationally recognized as helping with trauma, helping with repeat offense, that type of mediation is useful after the fact, but also immediately before it happens. There's just one proviso, though. Very often community policing forums, patrollers, police love to mediate domestic violence cases and then see it as, we have now resolved the matter. We know that matters do not get resolved like that. That is one of the issues we also need to take up, that we make sure that proper support is given to victims of domestic violence, and that they get the proper trauma counselling that they require, and that there's a removal from households in many cases, and adequate shelters and adequate all of that. People going in and mediating domestic violence is a very dangerous thing, but again, there are people that are far greater experts in the field than I am. So we need to look at this, but the role of gang violence, taxi violence and such cannot be overemphasized in our murder rates. It is such and robberies. We look at interpersonal violence, but we are not focusing on the ones that the police can do something about, and it's those type of crimes. So I hope I haven't overstayed my welcome now, Lauren.
No, I think that's fine. It's very helpful to have these conversations, but it looks like, Guy, you have a response.
I just wanted to add something to what Lizette had said, I mean, around the hotspots, and it's really an anecdote, is that a former colleague of mine, Matthew Scudder, who used to be at UCT and was working with me, is now with VPUU, did an interesting hotspot study in Philippi East, which is an incredibly dangerous place. And through that process, Lizette, you were talking about identifying the micro spots within the hotspot, identified that, and the police were actually not that well aware of it, but the sort of challenge was presenting this information to the police, and there really wasn't any interest in dealing with it. And I think that's the problem in some of these places, is where there might be a leadership crisis, or the police have just become incredibly disillusioned. There's just too much crime. They're kind of struggling to cope, or don't feel welcome, and their relationship with the community is kind of broken down. So that was the kind of one aspect that I just really wanted to kind of reinforce what you said. And then Mike, sorry, I didn't respond to your question earlier about the mediation stuff, and I'm sure you are aware of it, but it's really just for the benefit of others in this meeting, about the sort of peace committee model that John Cartwright and Clifford Shearing were working around, and they did some quite interesting work in Worcester. Then they took it to Khayelitsha, and it was the sort of community kind of mediation, alternative dispute resolution to deal with minor issues and minor conflicts that have the potential to escalate into major conflicts. And their model was quite well, quite well received, seemed to have had good results, good evaluations that were done, but it became a victim of party political juggling, and it lost its funding and wasn't pursued because of changes in government, and that's really sad. And I agree absolutely, as much of the violence in areas, or particularly interpersonal violence between neighbors and residents, can actually be resolved through mediation. So yeah, that's an important point to be emphasized. So thank you.
Great, thanks, Guy. There's about 5 minutes left, so we do have time for 1 or 2 more questions. If anyone has any questions, please raise your hand. Otherwise, I think I'm not going to try to force conversation or force anybody to ask any questions. So unless there's any more hands, I think I'll just end it here and say thank you very much to both of our speakers, to Guy and Lizette, for taking time out to discuss the crime stats with us. And thank you everybody else for attending. Please join us next week as well, every Friday, for our webinars on SaferSpaces. Yes, that's it, unless anyone else has anything to say. Guy or Francesca from GIZ, or anyone from Civilian Secretariat.
Just quickly from my side, the next session, 5th of March, is going to be focused on gender-based violence. So we've got Lisa Vetten, who's going to be speaking next week, and we've got Cyan Alves, who runs the kind of office at the University of Cape Town that deals with these specific issues too. So we're going to have a really interesting conversation then. So please do join us. But thank you so much to everyone.
Okay, thanks. That's the end of the session then. Thank you everybody for joining. Yeah, we'd say goodbye from my side. Thanks. Bye.
Thanks so much, everyone. Bye.